The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Windsor Castle. Marcus Chen, a 32-year-old software engineer from California, stood among hundreds of tourists, his camera ready to capture the iconic changing of the guard ceremony. He had saved for 3 years to make this trip to England, and today was supposed to be the highlight of his vacation. What he didn't know was that his life was about to change in ways he could never imagine. Standing just 15 feet away from Marcus was James Mitchell, a 28-year-old Royal Guard who had served with distinction for 6 years. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, his bearskin hat stood tall and proud, and his face remained expressionless as tourists snapped photos and children pointed at him with excitement. James had learned to ignore the chaos around him. He had endured hours of standing perfectly still in rain, snow, and blazing heat. Nothing could break his concentration, or so he thought. Behind the crowd, a man named Derek Sullivan was having the worst morning of his life. The 45-year-old construction worker from Manchester had come to Windsor with his girlfriend, hoping to propose to her in front of the castle. He had the ring in his pocket, the speech memorized, and everything planned down to the last detail. But there was one problem he hadn't anticipated. His girlfriend had insisted on bringing her Pitbull, a massive 80-pound dog named Brutus. Derek hated that dog. Brutus had chewed his favorite boots, destroyed his couch, and once ate an entire birthday cake meant for Derek's mother. But his girlfriend loved that animal more than anything in the world, and if Derek wanted to marry her, he had to accept the package deal. So here he was, holding a thick leather leash attached to a dog that seemed to have more muscle than brain. The crowd grew larger as the ceremony time approached. Tourists pushed and shoved, trying to get the perfect angle for their photos. Children squeezed through gaps between adults, and street vendors shouted about their souvenirs. In all this chaos, Derek felt the leash slip slightly in his sweaty palm. He adjusted his grip, but Brutus was pulling hard, excited by all the smells and sounds around him. Marcus had finally found his spot. He stood right at the front, his expensive camera raised and ready. He had read that the best photos came from being as close as possible to the guards. Some tourists even tried to make the guards laugh or break their composure, though Marcus thought that was disrespectful. He just wanted a good, honest photo to hang in his living room back home. James noticed Marcus but didn't react. He had seen thousands of tourists like him, all eager and excited, treating the ceremony like a theme park attraction. James sometimes wished people understood that this wasn't just a show. These were real soldiers with real duties, protecting a real royal residence. But he kept these thoughts to himself and maintained his rigid stance. Then everything went wrong at once. A street musician started playing a loud trumpet nearby, and the sudden noise startled Brutus. The dog jerked backward with such force that the leash flew out of Derek's hand completely. For a split second, everyone froze. Derek's eyes went wide with horror. His girlfriend screamed, and Brutus, suddenly free and overwhelmed by the crowd, did what any confused and frightened animal would do. He ran, but Brutus didn't run away from the crowd. He ran straight into it, pushing through legs and knocking over shopping bags. People screamed and scattered, creating even more chaos. Parents grabbed their children. Tourists dropped their cameras. And Brutus, now in full panic mode, locked his eyes on the one thing that stood perfectly still in all the madness: James Mitchell, the Royal Guard. Marcus saw it happening in slow motion. The massive dog charging forward, its heavy paws thundering against the cobblestones. James standing perfectly still, either unaware or unable to break protocol, and Derek pushing through the crowd screaming for Brutus to stop, knowing his dog was heading straight for disaster. What happened next would shock everyone present. Brutus didn't attack James. Instead, the dog skidded to a stop right in front of the guard, sat down, and looked up at him with what could only be described as curiosity. The Pitbull tilted his head, his tongue hanging out, waiting for some kind of response. But James didn't move. He didn't even blink. His training had taught him to ignore all distractions, and he wasn't about to break that discipline now. Not even for an 80-pound Pitbull staring at him like he was the most interesting thing in the world. The crowd went silent. Hundreds of people held their breath, waiting to see what would happen. Would the dog attack? Would the guard break protocol? Would security intervene? Marcus had his camera raised, his finger on the shutter button, ready to capture whatever happened next. Derek finally pushed through to the front of the crowd. His face was red with embarrassment and fear. He reached for Brutus's collar. But the dog moved just out of reach, still focused on James. The guard's eyes remained forward, staring at some invisible point in the distance, his face showing no emotion whatsoever. Then Brutus did something nobody expected. He barked. Not an aggressive bark, but a playful one. The kind of bark a dog makes when it wants attention or playtime. He barked again, then pawed at the ground in front of James, his tail beginning to wag slightly. The crowd started to relax. Some people even began to laugh nervously. This wasn't an attack. This was a confused dog who had found the one person in the entire chaotic scene who wasn't running, screaming, or panicking. To Brutus, James represented calm and stability, and the dog wanted to be near that energy. But the situation was far from over. Security personnel were already moving through the crowd, their radios crackling with urgent messages. Other guards were being alerted. And somewhere in the castle, officials were being informed that there was an incident involving a loose dog and one of their royal guards. The consequences of this moment would ripple outward in ways none of them could predict, affecting lives, careers, and even international relations in the days to come. Security officer Sarah Williams had been working at Windsor Castle for 12 years, and she thought she had seen everything. Drunk tourists, protesters, even once a man who tried to climb the castle walls dressed as Spider-Man. But a Pitbull sitting calmly in front of a royal guard while hundreds of tourists watched was something new. She spoke quickly into her radio as she approached the scene, keeping her voice steady despite the adrenaline pumping through her veins. Derek Sullivan stood frozen, his hand still reaching toward Brutus but afraid to make any sudden moves. His girlfriend Rebecca had finally caught up to him, tears streaming down her face. She kept whispering apologies that nobody could hear over the murmur of the crowd. The ring Derek had planned to use for his proposal felt like a brick in his pocket now. This was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives, and instead, it was turning into a nightmare. James Mitchell remained perfectly still. Inside, his mind was racing. His training had covered many scenarios, but this specific situation had never come up in any drill or briefing. Was the dog dangerous? Should he break protocol and step back? What if the animal attacked and he couldn't defend himself without compromising his duty? These questions flashed through his mind in seconds, but his body didn't betray any of his internal struggle. To the outside world, he was a statue. Marcus had taken at least 30 photos in the last minute. His hands trembled slightly as he reviewed the images on his camera's screen. These weren't just good photos. These were incredible once-in-a-lifetime shots. The massive Pitbull sitting calmly, the guard's unwavering stance, the crowd's shocked faces in the background. He knew immediately that these images were special, but he had no idea just how special they would become. Sarah reached the scene and assessed the situation quickly. The dog didn't seem aggressive. Its body language was relaxed, almost playful. But protocols were protocols, and a loose animal near a royal guard was a serious security breach. She needed to remove the dog without causing panic or putting anyone in danger. She also needed to do it quickly, before her superiors arrived and started asking difficult questions. She approached Derek with a calm but firm voice. "Sir, is this your dog?" Derek nodded, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry." The leash slipped. "He's not dangerous, I swear. He's just confused and scared. Please, I can get him. Just give me a second." Rebecca grabbed Derek's arm. "Let me do it. He listens to me better." She moved forward slowly, calling Brutus's name in a soft, soothing voice. The dog's ears perked up, but he didn't move away from James. Instead, Brutus looked back at Rebecca, then at James, as if trying to decide which human deserved his attention more. The crowd had grown even larger now. People who had been exploring other parts of the castle grounds heard about the incident and came running. Some held up their phones, recording videos that would be uploaded to social media within minutes. Others just watched, fascinated by the bizarre standoff between man, dog, and duty. James could hear everything. The whispers, the camera clicks, the radio chatter from security. He could hear Rebecca calling the dog's name and Derek's mumbled apologies. But he didn't react. His commanding officer had once told him that a royal guard's greatest weapon wasn't his rifle, but his composure. "The moment you break," his officer had said, "is the moment you stop being a symbol and become just another person." James wasn't about to become just another person. Sarah made a decision. She pulled a small treat from her pocket, something she always carried for the police dogs that sometimes patrolled the grounds. She held it out toward Brutus and whistled softly. The dog's head turned immediately, his nose twitching as he caught the scent. For a moment it seemed like the plan would work. Brutus stood up and took a step toward Sarah. But then something unexpected happened. A tourist's child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, broke free from his mother's grip and ran forward, wanting to pet the dog. The mother screamed. The crowd gasped. And Brutus, startled by the sudden movement and noise, spun around and barked loudly. The child stopped in his tracks, frozen with fear. James finally moved. Not dramatically, but enough. He shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself between the child and the dog. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was enough to break his perfect stillness. He had made a choice, one that would later be debated by his superiors, analyzed by military protocol experts, and discussed in newspapers around the world. He had chosen humanity over duty, protection over protocol. Sarah moved fast. She grabbed the child and pulled him back to his mother in one smooth motion. Rebecca used the distraction to rush forward and grab Brutus's collar. The dog didn't resist. He seemed tired now, overwhelmed by all the attention and chaos. Derek quickly clipped the leash back on, his hands shaking so badly he needed 3 tries to get the clasp to work. The immediate crisis was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. More security officers arrived, along with castle officials in suits who looked very displeased. One of them, a stern woman in her 50s named Margaret Thornton, began taking statements from everyone involved. Derek and Rebecca were separated and questioned individually. Other officers reviewed the security camera footage, trying to understand exactly how the dog had gotten loose and why it had taken so long to secure the situation. Marcus stood off to the side, his camera clutched to his chest like a treasure. A security officer had asked him to stay, saying they might need his photos as part of their incident report. Marcus agreed, but he had already made a copy of the images on his phone. He had a journalist friend back in California who freelanced for major news outlets. These photos were too good not to share. James remained at his post. Another guard had offered to relieve him, but James had refused. He had 2 more hours left in his shift, and he intended to complete them. His slight movement to protect the child had been captured by dozens of cameras, and he knew there would be consequences. But he didn't regret it. Some things were more important than protocol. As the crowd slowly dispersed, people were already sharing their experiences. Social media began lighting up with posts about the incident. Videos showed different angles of Brutus sitting calmly in front of James. Photos captured the tense moment when the child ran forward. Within an hour, the story had spread beyond Windsor, beyond England, beginning its journey around the world. Derek and Rebecca were finally allowed to leave, but not before receiving a stern warning and a hefty fine for failing to properly control their animal in a restricted area. Rebecca was crying again, this time from relief that nobody had been hurt and that Brutus wouldn't be taken away. Derek put his arm around her, the proposal completely forgotten for now. They walked away from the castle with Brutus between them, the dog seeming completely unbothered by the chaos he had caused. Sarah filed her incident report, knowing it would trigger a chain of reviews, meetings, and probably some new regulations about animals near the guards. She had handled the situation as well as anyone could have, but in her 12 years of service, she had learned that handling something well didn't always mean avoiding criticism. The sun was reaching its peak as the normal rhythm of Windsor Castle resumed. Tourists took their photos. Guards stood at their posts. Vendors sold their souvenirs. But something had changed. A ripple had been created, and like all ripples, it would spread far beyond its source, touching lives and creating consequences that nobody could have predicted on that ordinary morning that had become anything but ordinary. By evening, Marcus Chen's photos had traveled farther than he ever imagined possible. His journalist friend, Tom Bradley, had immediately recognized the newsworthiness of the images and pitched them to 3 major news outlets within an hour of receiving them. All 3 wanted to buy the exclusive rights, but Tom negotiated something better. He sold the photos to a wire service, meaning they would appear in newspapers and websites across the globe simultaneously. Marcus sat in his hotel room, refreshing his email every few seconds. His inbox was exploding with messages. News organizations wanted interviews. Morning shows invited him to appear on their programs. A book publisher asked if he had considered writing about his experiences as a travel photographer. His social media followers had jumped from 200 to over 50,000 in just 6 hours. It was overwhelming and exciting and terrifying all at once. Half a world away in California, Marcus's wife Jennifer was fielding phone calls at their home. Reporters had somehow found their phone number and address. Neighbors were messaging her, asking if the Marcus Chen in the news was her husband. Her mother called 3 times, worried that Marcus had been hurt in some kind of animal attack. Jennifer finally stopped answering the phone and sent Marcus a simple text message that read, "What did you do?" At Windsor Castle, James Mitchell was dealing with a very different kind of attention. He had been called into a meeting with his commanding officer, Colonel Andrew Richardson, a man with 30 years of military service and very little tolerance for deviations from protocol. The meeting took place in a small office overlooking the castle grounds, and James stood at attention while the colonel reviewed the incident reports and watched the video footage for what seemed like the 100th time. Colonel Richardson finally spoke. His voice measured and controlled. "You moved, Mitchell. You broke your stance to position yourself between a child and a dog. Can you explain your reasoning?" James kept his eyes forward, his voice steady. "Sir, I assessed the situation and determined that the child was in potential danger. My movement was minimal and intended to provide a protective barrier without creating additional panic or fully abandoning my post." The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying James carefully. "You understand that your primary duty is to maintain your post and represent the discipline and tradition of the Queen's Guard. Personal judgment calls are not encouraged in your role." "Yes, sir." "I understand, sir. And yet you made one anyway." "Yes, sir." There was a long silence. Colonel Richardson tapped his fingers on the desk, a habit James had noticed the colonel had when he was thinking through a difficult decision. Finally, the colonel spoke again. "The public sees you as a hero, Mitchell. Social media is calling you the Guard with a heart. The newspapers are praising your quick thinking. The palace has received hundreds of emails commending your actions, but you and I both know that's not how military discipline works." James said nothing. He knew the colonel was right. Public opinion didn't change the rules, and the rules were clear. A guard maintains his post in composure at all times unless ordered otherwise, or facing a direct threat to the royal family or property. A loose dog and a wandering child didn't qualify as such a threat. Meanwhile, Derek Sullivan and Rebecca Foster were having the worst night of their relationship. They sat in their small apartment in Manchester, the television muted but showing news coverage of the incident. Derek's face appeared briefly in some of the videos, looking panicked and embarrassed. Rebecca's social media accounts had been discovered by internet users, and she was receiving a mixture of criticism and support from complete strangers. "They're calling Brutus a dangerous dog," Rebecca said, her voice hollow. "They're saying we're irresponsible pet owners who should never be allowed near animals again." Derek rubbed his face with both hands. "Some people are defending us. Look at this comment here. This person says accidents happen and that we obviously care about Brutus. But look at all these others. They're saying we should be arrested, that Brutus should be put down. Derek, what if they try to take him away?" Brutus, completely unaware of the controversy he had caused, lay sleeping on his bed in the corner, snoring softly. Derek looked at the dog and felt a complicated mixture of frustration and protectiveness. He still didn't particularly like Brutus, but the idea of anyone taking him away or harming him made his blood boil. The dog was family now, whether Derek liked it or not. Rebecca's phone rang. It was a reporter from a tabloid newspaper offering them money for an exclusive interview. Rebecca declined and blocked the number. 3 minutes later, another call came from a different publication. Then another. They finally turned off their phones entirely. Back at Windsor Castle, Sarah Williams was also dealing with the aftermath. She had been praised by her immediate supervisor for handling the situation well, but there was talk of new protocols being implemented. Dogs would no longer be allowed within a certain distance of the guards. Security checkpoints would be established earlier in the tourist route. Some officials were even suggesting that the changing of the guard ceremony should be moved to a more controlled environment. Sarah thought these measures were excessive. The incident had been a one-time accident, not a systemic failure. But she had been in security long enough to know that one dramatic incident often led to policy overreactions. The video footage of Brutus sitting calmly in front of James had been viewed millions of times, and public embarrassment often demanded visible responses, even if those responses didn't actually improve safety. the global media coverage continued to intensify. In Japan, morning shows discussed British military protocols and interviewed cultural experts about the significance of the Royal Guards. In Australia, radio hosts debated whether James should be commended or disciplined for his actions. In Brazil, the photos appeared on the front page of newspapers with headlines about duty versus humanity. American late-night talk show hosts made jokes about the incident. One host quipped that the dog had shown more interest in British history than most American tourists. Another created a fake interview with Brutus, using a silly voice and making jokes about royal protocol. The segment went viral, adding another layer to the already complex story. Marcus received a call from his employer back in California. His boss, usually a serious and demanding man, was surprisingly enthusiastic. "Marcus, you've put our company on the map. Do you know how many times our name has been mentioned in the media today? I'm giving you an extra week of vacation and a bonus. Whatever you're doing over there, keep doing it." Jennifer sent Marcus another message, this time more supportive. "I've been reading about everything. I'm proud of you, but also a bit worried. This is getting really big, really fast." "Are you okay over there?" Marcus typed back, "I'm fine. Just overwhelmed. These photos have changed everything. I don't know what happens next. Neither did anyone else involved in the incident." James didn't know if he would face formal discipline or unexpected commendation. Derek and Rebecca didn't know if they would face legal consequences or if Brutus would be safe. Sarah didn't know how her job would change. Marcus didn't know if his 15 minutes of fame would lead to lasting opportunities or just be a brief flash in the pan. What they all did know was that a single moment, a slip of a leash, a startled dog, and an unwavering guard had created something much larger than any of them. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading across continents and cultures, meaning different things to different people. To some, it was a story about duty and discipline. To others, it was about compassion and quick thinking. To many, it was simply an amusing anecdote about a dog who had no idea he had become famous. The night wore on. In California, Marcus finally stopped checking his emails and went to bed, his mind racing with possibilities. In Manchester, Derek and Rebecca held each other on the couch, with Brutus snoring peacefully at their feet. At Windsor Castle, James completed his final report about the incident, choosing his words carefully, knowing they would be read and analyzed by people far above his pay grade. And around the world, millions of people shared, commented, and debated about what they had seen in those viral photos and videos. The story was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. 3 days after the incident, Colonel Richardson made his decision about James Mitchell. The meeting took place in the same office, but this time, the colonel's expression was different. Not angry, not disappointed, but something James couldn't quite read. The colonel gestured for James to sit, which was unusual. Normally, these meetings were conducted with James standing at attention. "I've spent the last 72 hours in meetings," the colonel began, "with palace officials, military brass, public relations people, and even someone from the Prime Minister's office. Everyone has an opinion about what should happen to you." James felt his stomach tighten but kept his face neutral. "Yes, sir. Some wanted you disciplined, reprimanded for breaking protocol. Others wanted you promoted and turned into a public relations asset." The debate got quite heated at times. The colonel paused, a slight smile crossing his face. "But here's what we've decided, nothing." James blinked, the first crack in his composure. "Sir, you're receiving neither punishment nor commendation. Officially, your actions were a minor deviation from protocol that did not compromise security or the dignity of your position. Unofficially, you showed good judgment in a unique situation. You remain a Royal Guard in good standing. This incident will not appear on your service record as either positive or negative. It simply won't appear at all." "I understand, sir. Thank you, sir. However," the colonel continued, "you should know that you've become something of a celebrity. We've received interview requests from over 40 media outlets. A film production company inquired about the rights to your story. A children's book author wants to write a book featuring you and the dog. Obviously, we've declined all of these on your behalf." James nodded slowly, trying to process this information. "I appreciate that, sir. I have no interest in publicity." "Good. Because here's the difficult part, Mitchell. For the next few months, tourists are going to recognize you. They're going to want photos with you specifically. Some will try to make you break your composure more aggressively than usual. We're assigning additional security to monitor the situation, but you need to be prepared for increased attention. In Manchester, Derek Sullivan's phone rang with an unknown number. He had been ignoring most calls, but something made him answer this one. A warm voice greeted him from the other end. "Mr. Sullivan, my name is Patricia Green. I'm a producer for a morning talk show called Good Morning Britain. We'd like to invite you, Rebecca, and Brutus to appear on our program to share your side of the story." Derek's first instinct was to refuse, but Patricia continued quickly. "I understand you've been receiving some negative attention online. This would be an opportunity to show people who you really are. We're not looking for drama or confrontation, just an honest conversation about what happened. We'll pay for your travel and accommodation, and we're offering a £3,000 appearance fee." Derek covered the phone and turned to Rebecca, who was listening intently. They had been struggling financially lately, with Rebecca's hours cut at work and Derek between construction jobs. £3,000 would cover their rent for 2 months and give them some breathing room. Rebecca nodded slowly. "We'll do it," Derek said into the phone. Marcus Chen was having a very different conversation across an ocean. He sat in a cafe in London, meeting with Rachel Morrison, a literary agent who had flown from New York specifically to talk with him. Rachel was sharp, professional, and full of ideas about how to capitalize on Marcus's sudden fame. "Your photos tell a story," Rachel said, sliding a folder across the table. "But I think there's a bigger story here. A book about the unexpected moments of travel. How a single photograph can change a photographer's life. How ordinary people become part of extraordinary moments." "Publishers are interested, Marcus." "Very interested." Marcus sipped his coffee, feeling overwhelmed. "I'm not a writer. I'm a photographer and a software engineer. You'd work with a ghostwriter, someone who can take your experiences and turn them into compelling prose. You provide the stories and images, they provide the writing skill. It's done all the time. How much are we talking about?" Rachel smiled. "The initial offers are ranging from $75,000 to $150,000, and that's just for the advance. If the book does well, you could earn much more from royalties." Marcus thought about his mortgage, his car payment, Jennifer's student loans. He thought about all the times they had carefully budgeted, worried about unexpected expenses, put off small luxuries because they couldn't quite afford them. $150,000 would change their lives. "What do I need to do?" At Windsor Castle, Sarah Williams sat in a conference room with a dozen other security personnel, reviewing the new protocols that had been implemented after the incident. Dogs were now prohibited within a 50-meter radius of any guard on duty. Security checkpoints had been established with clearer signage. Officers were receiving additional training on crowd control and animal management. Sarah listened to the presentations and nodded in the right places, but privately she thought the whole thing was excessive. They were implementing millions of pounds worth of changes because of one dog who hadn't actually hurt anyone, but she kept her opinions to herself. She had learned long ago that security was as much about perception as reality. The public needed to feel safe, even if they had never actually been in danger. The television appearance transformed Derek, Rebecca, and Brutus overnight. The interview went well, with both Derek and Rebecca coming across as genuine, humble people who had made an honest mistake. Brutus, to everyone's surprise, behaved perfectly on set, sitting calmly and even performing a few tricks when prompted. The show's hosts were charmed, the audience was sympathetic, and by the end of the segment, public opinion had shifted significantly in their favor. Social media began filling with supportive messages. A dog training company offered them free sessions to ensure Brutus's leash training was solid. A pet supply store sent them a complimentary package of high-quality leashes, collars, and training equipment. Someone even created a social media account for Brutus that gained 10,000 followers in a single day. Rebecca cried when she saw how the tide had turned. "People don't hate us anymore," she said, scrolling through the comments on her phone. "They understand it was just an accident." Derek felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The ring was still in his drawer at home. He had been too stressed and preoccupied to even think about proposing over the past few days. But now, with things calming down and their lives returning to something resembling normal, he began thinking about it again. Maybe this whole disaster had actually brought them closer together. Maybe it was time to turn something terrible into something beautiful. James Mitchell returned to duty, and just as Colonel Richardson had predicted, tourists recognized him. Some were respectful, taking photos from a distance. Others were bolder, trying to get him to smile or react. A few even brought their dogs, though security quickly intervened. James handled it all with his usual composure, though he sometimes wondered if his life would ever feel normal again. Marcus signed the book deal. The contract was thick and full of legal language he barely understood, but Rachel assured him it was standard. He would spend the next 6 months working with a writer named David Kim, sharing stories from his travels, explaining his photography philosophy, and recounting the events at Windsor Castle in detail. The book would be titled The Shot That Changed Everything. Jennifer was supportive but cautious when Marcus returned home. "This is amazing," she said, reviewing the contract. "But Marcus, what happens after this? What if the book doesn't sell? What if this is your only moment of fame and then it's gone? We can't build our future on one viral photo." Marcus understood her concerns, but he also felt something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement, possibility, the sense that his life was bigger than his cubicle at work and his weekend photography hobby. He had tasted something different and he wanted more of it. "I don't know what happens next," he admitted, "but I know I have to try. If I don't take this chance, I'll regret it for the rest of my life." As weeks passed, the immediate frenzy around the incident began to fade. News cycles moved on to other stories. The viral videos received fewer views each day. People stopped sharing the photos quite as often. But for everyone involved, life had fundamentally changed. James had proven something to himself. That he could make decisions under pressure and live with the consequences. That duty and compassion didn't have to be opposites. That sometimes the right choice was the one that broke the rules. Derek and Rebecca were planning their wedding. The proposal had finally happened, on a quiet evening at home with just the two of them and Brutus. It wasn't the grand romantic gesture Derek had originally planned at the castle, but it was perfect in its own way. Simple, honest, and genuine. Marcus was learning to be a writer, or at least learning to work with one. His sessions with David Kim were challenging but rewarding. David pushed him to dig deeper into his memories, to find the emotions behind the images, to understand why this moment at Windsor Castle had resonated with so many people. Sarah was training the new security recruits, making sure they understood both the protocols and the reasoning behind them. She taught them about 6 months after the incident. Marcus Chen's book was published. The Shot That Changed Everything hit bookstores on a Tuesday morning in March, and by Friday it had sold 15,000 copies. Rachel called him with updates every few hours, her excitement growing with each report. By the end of the first week, the book had cracked the top 50 on several bestseller lists. Jennifer had taken time off work to help Marcus with his book tour. They traveled to 12 cities in 3 weeks, and Marcus did readings, signings, and interviews at each stop. The audiences were diverse. Some were photography enthusiasts who wanted to learn about Marcus's techniques. Others were people who had followed the Windsor Castle story and wanted to hear more details. Many were simply drawn to the idea that ordinary moments could become extraordinary. At a bookstore in Seattle, an elderly woman approached Marcus after his reading. She held a copy of the book close to her chest, her eyes watery with emotion. "Thank you for writing this," she said softly. "My husband passed away last year. He was a photographer too. Reading your book reminded me of all the trips we took together, all the moments we captured. You helped me remember the joy." Marcus signed her book with trembling hands. This was what he hadn't expected about the book's success. It wasn't just about the viral photos or the famous incident. People were connecting to something deeper. The idea that paying attention to the world around you, being ready for the unexpected, could lead to magic. Back in England, James Mitchell was also experiencing unexpected connections. During a rare day off, he visited a veterans hospital to spend time with former soldiers. It was something he did regularly, a quiet way to give back to the military community, but this time was different. An older veteran named William Patterson recognized him immediately. "You're the guard from that video," William said, his voice rough but warm. "The one with the dog?" James smiled slightly. "Yes, sir. That was me. I was a guard too, back in the 70s. Never had anything quite that exciting happen to me." William laughed, then grew more serious. "But I understand what you did that day. That choice you made. Sometimes the hardest thing is knowing when to hold your ground and when to move. Not everyone understands that." They talked for over an hour. William shared stories from his own service, the moments that had defined his career, the choices he had questioned for years afterward. James found himself opening up in ways he rarely did, talking about the pressure of being constantly watched, the weight of representing something larger than himself. "The thing people don't understand about being a guard," William said, "is that you're not really standing still. You're constantly making micro-decisions. Every person who walks by, every sound, every change in the environment. You're processing it all, determining if it's a threat, deciding how to respond. What you did that day, protecting that child, that wasn't breaking your duty. That was fulfilling it." James left the hospital feeling lighter than he had in months. The validation from someone who truly understood meant more than any public praise or media attention. It reminded him why he had chosen this career in the first place. Not for glory or recognition, but to be part of something meaningful. Derek and Rebecca's wedding took place on a sunny Saturday in late April. It was a small ceremony at a local church with about 50 guests. Brutus attended as well, wearing a bow tie and behaving impeccably. During the reception, Derek gave a speech that brought many guests to tears. "6 months ago," he said, "I thought my proposal was ruined. I thought the worst day of my life had destroyed my chance at happiness. But Rebecca taught me something important. She taught me that love isn't about perfect moments in perfect places. It's about standing together when things fall apart. It's about holding on when everything goes wrong." That day at Windsor Castle was chaotic and embarrassing and scary. But we got through it together. And if we can handle that, we can handle anything. The wedding gift that touched them most came from an unexpected source. A handwritten card arrived 3 days before the wedding, postmarked from Windsor. Inside was a note that read, "Wishing you both a lifetime of happiness and better behaved adventures. Congratulations on your marriage." It was signed simply JM with no return address. Rebecca cried when she read it. "Do you think it's really from him? From the guard?" Derek didn't know, but he wanted to believe it was. The idea that even James Mitchell, the man who had been at the center of their disaster, bore them no ill will and wished them happiness, meant everything. Sarah Williams received a promotion to senior security coordinator. The promotion came with more responsibility, better pay, and a larger office. But what she valued most was the increased autonomy to make decisions about security protocols. She immediately began reviewing some of the more excessive measures that had been implemented after the incident. During a meeting with castle officials, she made her case. "The new protocols have made tourists feel like suspects rather than guests. We've created so much distance between the guards and visitors that the experience has lost some of its magic. Yes, security is important, but so is accessibility. We need to find a better balance." Her proposal was met with some resistance, but ultimately, several of the more restrictive measures were relaxed. Dogs were still prohibited near the guards, but the buffer zone was reduced. Security checkpoints remained, but were made less intimidating. Small changes, but ones that Sarah believed honored both safety and the spirit of why people came to Windsor Castle in the first place. Marcus's success opened unexpected doors. A major camera company approached him about becoming a brand ambassador. A travel magazine offered him a regular column. A documentary filmmaker wanted to create a film about his work. Marcus found himself having to make choices about his career path, decisions that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. Jennifer watched her husband transform from a man who talked about his dreams to a man who was living them. It was beautiful and sometimes difficult. Marcus was gone more often now, traveling for work. Their quiet evenings together became less frequent. She loved his success, but she also mourned the simple life they had shared before Windsor Castle. One night, after Marcus returned from a particularly long trip, they had an honest conversation about their future. Jennifer expressed her concerns, and Marcus listened without defensiveness. They agreed to set boundaries. No more than 2 trips per month. Sunday evenings were always reserved for just the 2 of them. Success was wonderful, but not at the cost of their relationship. James received a letter from a young boy named Timothy, who lived in London. Timothy's father was in the military and had been deployed overseas. The boy wrote that watching the video of James standing firm and then protecting the child had helped him understand what his father did for a living. "You showed me that being brave doesn't mean never being afraid," Timothy wrote. "It means doing the right thing even when it's hard. My dad does that too." James kept the letter in his locker at the castle. On difficult days, when tourists were particularly demanding or when he questioned his career choices, he would read Timothy's words again. It reminded him that his actions mattered, sometimes in ways he would never fully know or understand. The social media account for Brutus had grown to over 200,000 followers. Rebecca had initially managed it as a joke, posting silly photos and captions from the dog's perspective. But as the account grew, she realized it had potential. A pet food company approached her about a sponsorship deal. A dog toy manufacturer wanted to create a Brutus signature line. What had started as a disaster was slowly becoming a source of income and opportunity. Derek was initially uncomfortable with the idea of profiting from their mistake. But Rebecca helped him see it differently. "We're not profiting from our mistake," she explained. "We're sharing Brutus's story, which just happens to include that moment. People connect with him because he's a regular dog who had an extraordinary day. Just like we're regular people who had an extraordinary day." As summer approached, all the major players in the Windsor Castle incident had found their new normal. Their lives had been changed, some dramatically and others subtly, by a single moment when a leash slipped and a dog chose to sit in front of a guard instead of running away. Marcus looked at his career trajectory and marveled at the improbability of it all. One photograph had become a book, which had become a career, which had become a life he had only dreamed about. He thought about all the photos he had taken over the years that nobody had noticed. What made this one special? Was it timing? Luck? Skill? He still wasn't sure, but he was grateful regardless. James stood at his post, his face composed and his stance perfect. He had learned to tune out the whispers and pointing that still occasionally happened when tourists recognized him. He had also learned something more valuable, that the rigid protocols he had been trained to follow were not chains but guidelines. That true discipline included knowing when to bend without breaking. That duty and compassion could exist in the same moment, in the same person, in the same choice. The Windsor Castle incident had created ripples that continued spreading outward, touching lives in ways both big and small. But perhaps the most profound change had happened internally, in the hearts and minds of those directly involved. 1 year after the incident, Windsor Castle held a special ceremony to celebrate its 800th anniversary. Dignitaries from around the world attended, along with thousands of tourists who had entered a lottery for the chance to witness the historic event. The guards performed a special drill, their movements precise and synchronized, a display of discipline and tradition that had defined the castle for centuries. James Mitchell was selected to be part of the honor guard for the ceremony. It was recognition of his years of exemplary service, though everyone knew his selection also had something to do with his brief moment of fame. As he stood in formation, James could feel the weight of history around him. 800 years of soldiers had stood where he stood now, each one facing their own challenges, making their own choices, leaving their own mark however small. In the crowd, Marcus Chen stood with his camera, no longer just a tourist but a working photographer, contracted by a major publication to document the event. Jennifer stood beside him, 7 months pregnant with their first child. They had decided to combine his work trip to England with a baby moon, a last big adventure before their lives changed forever in a different way. Marcus raised his camera and captured the ceremony with professional precision. But between official shots, he found himself looking for the unexpected moments. A child's face lit up with wonder. An elderly veteran saluting the guards with tears in his eyes. A young couple holding hands, whispering to each other about their own plans and dreams. These moments, Marcus had learned, were just as important as the grand official ones, sometimes more so. Derek and Rebecca watched the ceremony from their living room in Manchester, broadcast live on television. Brutus slept at their feet, completely unaware of his role in the castle's recent history. Rebecca was 5 months pregnant, her hand resting on her growing belly. They had talked about what to tell their child about the day at Windsor Castle. Would it be a funny family story? A cautionary tale? A moment of pride? "I think," Derek said during a commercial break, "we tell them the truth. That we made a mistake and it caused chaos, but we handled it with dignity. That something embarrassing became something that brought us closer together. That life is unpredictable, and how we respond to the chaos matters more than the chaos itself." Rebecca squeezed his hand. "I like that." At the ceremony, Colonel Richardson gave a speech about tradition and evolution, about honoring the past while adapting to the present. He didn't mention the incident directly, but those who knew him understood the subtext. The Pitbull incident had forced the castle to examine its security protocols. its relationship with the public, and its understanding of what duty really meant. Not all change was bad. Not all tradition was sacred. Finding the balance was the eternal challenge. Sarah Williams stood near the security perimeter, coordinating her team with practiced efficiency. The ceremony had gone perfectly, with no incidents or concerns. She had implemented lessons learned from the Brutus situation, creating protocols that were both secure and reasonable, protective without being paranoid. As she watched the ceremony conclude, she felt a sense of professional satisfaction. Security wasn't about preventing every possible problem. It was about managing risks while preserving what made something worth protecting in the first place. After the ceremony, James was granted a rare break before his evening shift. He walked through the castle grounds, still in uniform but allowed to move freely for 30 minutes. He found himself near the spot where Brutus had sat that morning a year ago. The cobblestones looked the same. The angle of the sun was similar. But everything had changed. A young family approached him cautiously. The father asked if they could take a photo with James. The mother held a baby who couldn't have been more than 6 months old. James agreed, breaking protocol slightly by offering a small smile for the photo. As they walked away, thanking him profusely, James realized something. That moment with Brutus hadn't diminished the respect people had for the guards. If anything, it had humanized them, made them more relatable without making them less impressive. Marcus's book continued to sell steadily, never reaching the spectacular peaks of the first month, but maintaining consistent numbers that translated into a reliable income stream. His publisher wanted a second book, this one about unexpected moments in everyday life. Marcus was writing it slowly, carefully, trying to capture lightning in a bottle twice while knowing it probably wouldn't work the same way. But that was okay. He had learned that success wasn't about repeating the same magic over and over. It was about showing up, doing the work, and being ready when magic decided to happen again. Timothy, the young boy who had written to James, visited Windsor Castle with his father, who had returned safely from deployment. They stood in the crowd watching the guards, and Timothy pointed out which one was James. His father listened to Timothy explain what he had learned about duty and courage, and felt his heart swell with pride. Not just for his son's understanding, but for the guard who had unknowingly taught his son these lessons. James and Timothy's father made eye contact briefly. No words were exchanged, but there was recognition. One serviceman acknowledging another. One father figure recognizing another father figure. A moment of mutual respect that meant more than any medal or commendation. Brutus, still blissfully unaware of his internet fame, had become something of a local celebrity in Manchester. People recognized him on walks and asked to pet him. Children pointed and told their parents about the famous dog from the castle. Rebecca had used the sponsorship money to enroll Brutus in advanced training classes, not because he needed them, but because she wanted to ensure nothing like Windsor ever happened again. The trainer, an experienced woman named Margaret, told Rebecca something that stuck with her. Brutus isn't a bad dog. He never was. He was just overwhelmed that day. The mistake wasn't his behavior. The mistake was putting him in a situation he wasn't prepared to handle. Learn from that, for the dog and for yourselves. Rebecca had applied that wisdom beyond just dog training. She and Derek had learned to better assess situations, to recognize when they were overwhelmed, to ask for help before things spiraled out of control. The Windsor incident had been embarrassing, but it had taught them valuable lessons about preparation, responsibility, and grace under pressure. Marcus and Jennifer's baby was born 3 months after the anniversary ceremony. They named her Claire, and Marcus took fewer work trips to be present for her first months of life. He found himself taking thousands of photos, not for publication or profit, but just to capture his daughter's life. These photos would never be famous or viral. They would never make him money or advance his career. But they were, in their own way, the most important photos he would ever take. James Mitchell continued his service at Windsor Castle. He trained new guards, sharing not just the technical aspects of the role but the philosophical ones. He talked about the weight of tradition and the necessity of judgment. He told them about the day with the Pitbull, not as a war story or a source of pride, but as a teaching moment. You will face situations not covered in any manual, he told them. Trust your training, but also trust yourself. 5 years after the incident, a documentary film crew was granted rare access to Windsor Castle to create a program about the Royal Guards. They interviewed James, now promoted to sergeant, about his experiences. When they asked about the Pitbull incident, James smiled slightly, the most emotion he allowed himself on camera. "People remember that day as the time a guard almost got attacked by a dog," James said. "But that's not what happened. What happened was everyone involved, from the tourists to the dog owners to security to me. We all had to make choices in a moment of chaos. Some of those choices were better than others. But we all did our best with the information and time we had. That's all any of us can do." The documentary became popular, reigniting interest in the original incident. Marcus's book saw a spike in sales. Brutus's social media account gained another 100,000 followers. Derek and Rebecca appeared on a morning show again, this time with their 4-year-old daughter Emma, talking about how the incident had changed their lives for the better. Marcus, now an established photographer and author, was asked to give a TEDx talk about his experience. He titled it, "The Moment That Changes Everything," and spoke about being prepared for opportunity, about how success is often a combination of skill, preparation, and sheer luck. He showed a slide of the famous photo, Brutus sitting calmly in front of James, and explained what made it resonate with so many people. "This photo works because it captures something universal," Marcus told the audience. "The clash between order and chaos, between duty and improvisation, between what we're supposed to do and what we actually do when faced with the unexpected. Every person who sees this photo projects their own experiences onto it. They remember times they had to choose between following the rules and doing what felt right. That's why it spread so far and meant so much. Not because it was a perfect photo technically, but because it was a perfect photo emotionally." Sarah Williams retired from Windsor Castle after 30 years of service. Her farewell ceremony included testimonials from colleagues who praised her balanced approach to security.